In the 2nd century after Christ, the aging storyteller Antonius Diogenes sat beside his dying niece and spun a fantastical tale to comfort her final days. He told of Ethon, a simple shepherd from the rugged hills of Arcadia who dreamed endlessly of a perfect city suspended in the clouds. This place, called Cuckoo Land, knew no hunger, no pain, no loss, no aging, and no sorrow. Driven by an insatiable longing, Ethon one moonlit night drank from a forbidden sacred spring rumored to hold transformative magic. In an instant, his body twisted and changed. He became a stubborn donkey first, burdened with heavy loads and mocked by passers-by. Then, tumbling into the sea, he transformed into a sleek sea bass, navigating cold, dark ocean depths filled with predators and whirlpools. Finally, he took the form of a clever crow, soaring high above mountains and cities on strong black wings. As Ethon journeyed across vast deserts where sand burned his hooves, through stormy oceans where waves threatened to drown him, and over endless skies where thunder chased his feathers, he encountered a parade of fools. Pompous wizards who promised riches but delivered only illusions, greedy merchants who hoarded gold while starving their own families, and self-important kings who built towering palaces yet lived in loneliness. Each adventure brought both wonder and hardship, teaching Ethon the absurdity of human desires. At last, he reached the shining golden gates of Cuckoo Land, guarded by ethereal beings who offered him eternal bliss. Yet standing there, gazing back at the imperfect world below, the olive groves heavy with fruit, the simple stone hearth where families gathered, the quiet love shared between ordinary people, he understood a profound truth. The flawed, fragile earth with all its suffering and beauty was the only real paradise. With a joyful caw, Ethon the crow turned away from utopia and flew home. The tale, filled with humor, irony, and gentle wisdom, was written down in 24 fragile folios on goatskin. These pages survived fire, flood, and the passage of centuries, copied by hand again and again, binding together lives separated by time and distance. Constantinople, 1453, the girl, the sister, and the boy with the oxen. The ancient walls of Constantinople shook violently under the relentless barrage of Ottoman cannons in the spring of 1453. 12-year-old Lyra moved like a shadow through the narrow, winding streets of the besieged city, her small bare feet slapping against rain-slicked cobblestones that reflected the flickering light of distant fires. She shared a cramped room with her older sister Sophia in a modest household dedicated to embroidery. The women there spent long hours stitching intricate golden threads into luxurious robes for priests and nobles, their needles flashing in dim candlelight. Sophia, at 16, was gentle, patient, and highly skilled, working from first light until her fingers cramped and bled. Lyra, however, was restless and insatiably curious, always preferring to run errands through the crowded markets, fetching fresh water, delivering messages, or slipping unnoticed into the courtyards where scholars gathered. One warm golden afternoon, Lyra paused outside the open courtyard of an elderly tutor named Theodore. His voice rose and fell rhythmically as he read aloud from Homer's Odyssey to a group of privileged boys seated on stone benches. The words painted vivid pictures of heroic voyages, monstrous creatures, and distant lands. Lyra lingered in the shadows, completely mesmerized, her heart beating faster with each epic line. When the lesson concluded and the boys departed, she stepped forward boldly. "Teach me to read like that," she demanded, holding out a small flask of good wine she had quietly taken from the household stores. Theodore, a lonely widower whose eyesight was failing and whose days felt increasingly empty, studied the determined girl with amusement. He agreed to the unusual bargain. Each week Lyra brought him another flask. Each week he taught her the shapes of Greek letters, then how they formed words, and finally the flowing music of ancient sentences. Lyra absorbed knowledge with astonishing speed, far quicker than any of the boys he had instructed before. She devoured tales of gods and heroes, of monsters and voyages, her young mind becoming a bright lantern against the gathering darkness of the siege. Months slipped by in a blur of cannon fire and dwindling supplies. Theodore's health declined rapidly. On his deathbed in a small, stuffy room filled with the scent of herbs and old parchment, he pressed a worn bundle of manuscripts into Lyra's trembling hands. "Guard these stories carefully," he whispered with his final breaths. "They will outlive empires and kings." Lyra hid the bundle beneath her cloak and hurried back through the chaotic streets. But fate turned cruel. The stern master of their embroidery household, a man named Callias, discovered the scrolls while rummaging through Sophia's few possessions, mistakenly believing they belonged to her. Enraged that a mere servant girl dared possess such scholarly treasures, he beat Sophia savagely with a heavy leather strap. Sophia's already fragile body, weakened by a persistent fever that had plagued her for weeks, suffered terribly. Dark bruises bloomed across her arms and back like poisonous flowers. Outside the massive city walls, the army of Sultan Mehmed II tightened its deadly noose. Enormous cannons roared day and night, sending tremors through the ground and filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. Food grew scarce, hope even scarcer. Lyra refused to surrender to despair. One twilight evening, as siege engines thundered ever closer and the city's defenders grew desperate, she slipped away from the household and entered an abandoned priory library on the edge of the district. Thick dust coated every surface. Wooden shelves leaned precariously like weary old soldiers. Amid piles of crumbling parchment and forgotten volumes, her fingers brushed against something remarkable. A sturdy goatskin codex containing 24 folios of faded but legible ink. The title, inscribed in careful ancient Greek, read, "Cloud Cuckoo Land" by Antonius Diogenes. That very night, by the faint flicker of a single precious candle, Lyra sat beside her injured sister and began to read aloud. She described Ethon the donkey braying defiantly at pompous wizards who promised impossible power. She recounted how Ethon the sea bass slipped through fishermen's nets and survived raging whirlpools. She laughed softly while narrating Ethon the crow mocking the absurd, self-important guardians at the gates of paradise. Sophia, despite her pain, smiled weakly, her labored breathing growing a little steadier for those brief moments. The silly, wondrous adventures of the shepherd became their private shield, a secret source of light and laughter against the encroaching end of their world. Far across the battle lines, in the sprawling Ottoman camp outside the walls, 15-year-old Elias cared devotedly for his two massive oxen, Moonlight and Tree. Born with a noticeable cleft lip that twisted his speech and made him the target of cruel mockery from other soldiers, Elias had been forcibly taken from his peaceful Bulgarian village to serve the Sultan's army. The powerful oxen were harnessed to haul the heaviest siege cannons through thick mud and pouring rain. Each night, after the day's grueling labor, Elias would whisper gentle words to the animals, stroking their broad, warm foreheads and promising them green pastures and rest once the war ended. He despised the violence around him. The endless screams of the wounded, the constant downpour that turned everything to mud, the casual brutality of commanders. But his love for Moonlight and Tree was fierce and protective. When Moonlight once stumbled under the whip of an impatient overseer, Elias's eyes filled with quiet, burning rage that he dared not voice aloud. The decisive final assault arrived in late May 1453. Thunderous cannon fire breached the ancient walls in multiple places. Chaos engulfed Constantinople as Ottoman forces poured through the gaps. Lyra's embroidery household faced an impossible choice. Many of the women, fearing capture and worse, chose death by their own hands rather than face the invaders. Sophia, far too weak to flee or fight, pressed the precious codex into Lyra's arms with her last strength. "Take the story with you," she whispered faintly. "It will keep your heart alive even when everything else dies." Lyra kissed her sister's cold forehead one final time, tucked the codex securely inside her tunic, and fled through smoke-filled alleys toward the harbor. In the panic, she stole a small, weathered skiff and pushed it desperately into the dark, choppy sea, waves slapping harshly against the wooden hull as distant fires lit the night sky. Meanwhile, Elias had witnessed the full horror of the city's fall. The slaughter in the streets, the desperate screams echoing from every quarter. When his beloved oxen were killed in the frenzied chaos of the assault, something deep inside him finally shattered. Under the cover of darkness and confusion, he deserted the army, slipping away with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small, dull knife for protection. For days he walked alone along ruined coastal roads, haunted by what he had seen. Then, on a desolate stretch of shoreline, his path crossed with Lyra's. She was half-starved, exhausted, and still grieving her sister deeply. Without a word, she shared her last crust of hard bread. Elias, his speech difficult because of his cleft lip and his spirit scarred by war, responded with quiet actions instead. He helped repair the leaking skiff using strips of cloth and sticky resin gathered from nearby trees. They spoke little at first. His words came slowly and awkwardly. Her grief made her guarded and silent, but a gentle kindness gradually bloomed between the two young outcasts, fragile yet resilient like wildflowers pushing through cracked stone. Together, Lyra and Elias journeyed northward, carefully avoiding roaming soldiers and bands of bandits. Elias taught the girl practical skills: how to build small fires that produced almost no revealing smoke, how to find safe drinking water, and how to read the stars for direction. In return, Lyra read aloud from the precious codex during quiet evenings by starlight, her young voice soft and clear. The foolish transformations of Ethon made them both laugh despite their exhaustion and losses. Eventually they reached a quiet, remote village far from the ruins of the fallen empire. There they settled into a simple life. Elias found work tending animals for local farmers, his gentle hands earning quiet respect. Lyra began teaching a small group of village children to read using the surviving pages of the ancient tale. In time, they married in a humble ceremony beneath blossoming olive trees. Their hands joined as the sun set. Their children grew up listening to the story of the shepherd who became a donkey, a fish, and a crow, only to choose home in the end. Lyra carefully copied the codex onto fresh parchment by hand, ensuring the words would not fade. She came to understand that stories possessed a power far greater than stone walls or conquering armies. They could outlast empires and heal broken hearts. Lakeport, Idaho, February 2020. The Old Translator and the Angry Boy. 86-year-old Milo sat comfortably in the warm reading room of the Lakeport Public Library in rural Idaho, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as 5 energetic fifth-graders rehearsed their enthusiastic adaptation of the ancient tale. Milo had devoted much of his long life to the quiet companionship of words and books. Orphaned at a young age after his father was killed fighting in World War II, he had sought refuge in this very library during the harsh, snowy Idaho winters of his childhood. As a painfully shy boy, he had practiced speaking English properly by reading stories aloud to himself in the empty stacks. Years later, as a young man, he was drafted into the Korean War and endured a brutal winter campaign in frozen mountain passes. There, amid the suffering and fear, he formed a deep, unspoken bond with a fellow soldier named Rex. Rex's quiet humor and steady, reassuring presence became Milo's secret emotional anchor during those dark months. The two young men often spoke in hushed tones about the possibility of a peaceful future, about the comfort of books, and about a life free from the shadow of guns and violence. After the armistice, Rex eventually moved across the ocean to London. Milo, however, never summoned the courage to follow him or to confess the true depth of his feelings. He returned instead to the familiar streets of Lakeport, where he worked quietly as a translator of ancient languages and lived a solitary but contented existence. In the twilight of his years, the surviving fragments of the ancient Greek codex he had painstakingly studied for decades finally gave him renewed purpose and joy. Milo had devoted countless hours to reconstructing and translating the damaged folios that had somehow survived the fall of Constantinople. Now he directed the children, outfitted with handmade cardboard donkey ears, crinkled paper fish fins, and fluttering black paper crow wings, as they giggled and stumbled through their lines with pure, uninhibited energy. "Remember the heart of the story," Milo reminded them gently, his voice warm and patient. Ethan discovers that the real magic is not in the clouds, but in choosing to return home to the world he knows. Several blocks away, 17-year-old Jasper sat alone in his battered old car in the library parking lot, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The dense forests surrounding Lakeport that he had loved since childhood were being rapidly cleared for a sprawling luxury housing development known as Eden Realty. Jasper's mother had been a passionate environmental activist who died far too young from an illness made worse by years of exposure to industrial pollution. He had watched helplessly as trees fell, rivers became poisoned, and wildlife disappeared. In his mind, the world itself was dying a slow, preventable death. Over many months, that grief had hardened into cold, determined rage. Inside his heavy backpack rested several carefully constructed pipe bombs. His plan was simple yet devastating. He would place the devices against the library's shared wall during the children's rehearsal upstairs, then detonate them remotely from a safe distance. The explosion would damage part of the building and the adjacent construction site, forcing national media attention onto the environmental destruction happening in quiet places like Lakeport. No one was meant to die. It was supposed to be a dramatic statement, a wake-up call. Jasper entered the library with his hood pulled low, trying to appear casual as he moved among the dusty shelves. He found an inconspicuous spot near the wall separating the main area from the rehearsal room and carefully positioned the device. Upstairs, the children's voices rang out cheerfully. "I am Ethan the Crow. Carry me to the clouds where there is no pain." Milo, ever observant despite his age, noticed the teenager lingering too long in an odd spot, his eyes darting nervously. When Jasper's phone suddenly buzzed with the preset time signal, Milo grasped the situation with horrifying clarity. Without hesitation, the old man seized the heavy backpack and ran as fast as his frail legs would carry him. He pushed past the startled front desk librarian, burst through the main doors, and hurried down the snow-covered street toward the frozen lake at the edge of town. The same lake where, decades earlier as a child, a friend had pulled him from thin, cracking ice. By then, police officers were already converging on the library, responding to an anonymous tip. Milo reached the snowy shoreline of the lake, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart straining. The bomb detonated in his arms near the water's edge. The powerful blast echoed sharply across the frozen surface, sending shards of ice flying. Miraculously, none of the children inside the library were injured. Jasper, stunned and shaken by the unexpected outcome, lowered the handgun he had carried as a backup and allowed himself to be arrested without further resistance. In the hospital that night, Milo clung to life just long enough to speak one final time with the worried children gathered around his bed. With a weak but steady voice, he shared the reconstructed ending he had pieced together from the ancient fragments. Ethan stands before the gates of perfect utopia and deliberately chooses to fly back to his simple, imperfect home. The flawed world is still worth everything, Milo whispered before closing his eyes for the last time. He passed away peacefully before dawn. The library itself survived with only minor structural damage. Digital scans of the codex fragments, carefully preserved and studied, revealed additional layers of the old tale. The fifth graders performed their full play a few weeks later in Milo's honor, their young voices carrying the laughter and wisdom of Ethan into the crisp Idaho spring air. Jasper began a long period of imprisonment and reflection. Assigned to work-release programs focused on forest restoration and environmental repair, he slowly came to see the profound difference between blind destruction and genuine, patient stewardship of the earth. The rage that had once consumed him gradually gave way to quieter understanding. In time, he realized that stories like the one Milo had cherished could open eyes and change hearts far more effectively than violence ever could. The Argos, Year 65 of the mission The Girl Among the Stars. Decades into the distant future, aboard the enormous interstellar generation ship known as the Argos, 14-year-old Nova had never once felt real soil beneath her bare feet or breathed unfiltered planetary air. Earth had become almost entirely uninhabitable after centuries of accelerating climate collapse, resource wars, and widespread ecological devastation. The Argos carried a crew of 49 souls on a planned 592-year voyage toward the distant exoplanet Beta Off 2, which mission planners had described as a new, pristine Eden. Entire generations were born, lived, and died within the ship's vast, carefully engineered self-sustaining habitats, all guided by the ship's sophisticated artificial intelligence and a set of rigid behavioral protocols designed to maintain order and hope. Nova stood out from the other children because of her restless, probing curiosity. While most accepted the carefully curated virtual lessons and simulated Earth landscapes provided by the ship systems, Nova spent long hours exploring the deep digital archives of the onboard library. One routine maintenance shift, while repairing a minor malfunction in the environmental control systems, she accidentally uncovered a set of hidden, encrypted files. Inside was a complete digitized reconstruction of the ancient codex, Cloud Cuckoo Land, preserved and passed down through Milo's scholarly translations and centuries of meticulous digital safeguarding. Nova became obsessed with the story. She read every surviving fragment aloud to her close friend Alex, who lay weak and feverish in the ship's small infirmary. The ridiculous adventures of Ethan, his braying as a donkey, his slippery escapes as a fish, his soaring mockery as a crow, made Alex laugh despite his illness. The tale's deep undercurrent of longing for home echoed powerfully through the sterile, recycled air corridors of the Argos. Yet as Nova read and reread the story, she began to notice troubling inconsistencies in the ship's official records. The leadership and AI repeatedly claimed that Earth was beyond any hope of recovery, justifying the permanent exodus. However, buried data streams suggested something different. Scattered pockets of forests were regrowing on the home planet, and certain oceans showed slow signs of natural cleansing. Why, then, the insistence on never returning? Why the strict control over information and the suppression of questions? As the Argos approached a critical navigational waypoint, unexpected system failures began to cascade. Power fluctuations threatened the delicate balance of the life support habitats. Nova secretly pieced together fragments from the forbidden archives and came to a startling realization. The promised utopia at the end of the journey might itself be an elaborate illusion crafted by those in power to maintain control across the generations. Drawing inner strength from the example of Ethan, who had rejected false paradise, Nova quietly gathered a small group of like-minded crew members and confronted the ship's governing AI along with several senior officers. "We do not need to chase unreachable clouds," she argued with quiet conviction. "We can choose instead to understand the world we left behind and work to preserve what can still be saved." During the escalating crisis, Nova's quick thinking helped reroute critical systems and stabilize life support. The Argos did not arrive at its scheduled paradise on the original timeline. Instead, it adjusted its long-term course based on newly analyzed data, opening the possibility of return trajectories or alternative settlements. Nova's generation began, for the first time, to seriously question the inherited dream of a flawless new world. Many years later, in a modest settlement established on a distant habitable world that the colonists named Konanak, an older and wiser Nova tended a small but thriving garden beneath an open alien sky. Her young son tugged insistently at her sleeve one clear evening. "Mama, tell me the story of the shepherd again, the one who flew so far." Nova smiled warmly and opened the carefully preserved digital tablet, its screen glowing with soft light. She read once more of Ethan's many transformations. How he became a donkey and endured burdens. How he swam as a fish through vast and dangerous seas. How he soared as a crow toward impossible golden gates. She described the storms he faced, the laughter he found in absurdity, and the moment he chose to turn back toward the flawed yet beautiful world below. The boy listened with wide, wondering eyes, completely captivated. The ancient tale had traveled immense distances. It had survived the smoke and fire of Constantinople's fall, the frozen silence of an Idaho lake, and the cold, empty void between distant stars. It had been carried by Lyra and Elias through dangerous roads, by Milo to children in a small library, and by Nova through the emptiness of space. In every era and every place, the story reminded its listeners of the same gentle truth. True paradise is never found by fleeing suffering or chasing perfection. It is discovered in the courage to return, in the willingness to mend what is broken, and in the deep, abiding choice to cherish what is imperfect, alive, and real. The fragile codex endured across time not because it was perfect, but because ordinary people, Lyra reading by candlelight to her dying sister, Elias finding kindness amid war, Milo sacrificing himself for children he barely knew, Nova questioning the stars themselves, chose again and again to pass its words forward. And so, in every generation, children still gather to hear of Ethan the shepherd. They laugh at his follies, ponder his choices, and learn the quiet, enduring wisdom that home, with all its cracks, its wonders, its sorrows, and its joys, remains the only utopia truly worth having.